Well, before we go on and talk about the moon, I'd like to finish up our discussion about Earth with Earth-terrestrial interactions. We talked about how the atmosphere of the Earth is interacting with solar radiation from the sun, but I also want to talk about meteorites and meteors. So review this topic. We've already mentioned a little bit about this. Let's say a bit more. The term meteor is really just this weird sort of term that goes all the way back to ancient Greek. And you say, well, what would a meteorologist study? Well, wait a minute. Physicists study physics, chemists study chemistry, biologists study biology, meteorologists, well, they don't study meteors, they study weather. Okay, maybe that's why they get it all wrong. It should be weatherologists. Okay, no, really, meteor actually comes from the Greek. It just means atmospheric. Because people would look up and see this flash of light in the sky, and it was just something up in the sky. And so the meteor was taken to be this something up in the sky. And so they had no idea it had anything to do with things in space either. In fact, by the time they got around to the 1800s, 1700s to 1800s, astronomers would be looking up in the sky and they would see a meteor and it would streak past some stars. Another astronomer hundreds of miles away might see the same meteor streaking past some stars, but it was different. And so they had triangulate and they realized the meteors were only about 50 miles up. And so that they thought this had nothing to do with astronomy. In fact, the general idea that most people had about meteors were that they had something to do with electricity, maybe. Maybe there's something like high altitude lightning, okay. And that was people thought they had solved the problem. But for centuries, people have been saying rocks fell from the sky. There have been famous examples of this. For example, there have been times in which battles have been decided by a rock that fell from the sky at an opportune time. For example, during a particular event back hundreds of years ago, there was a village being besieged by an army, and then a meteorite, rock came flying out of the sky and slammed into the village and did quite a bit of damage. And so the villagers said, "Oh wow, God isn't happy with this. He's throwing rocks at us." So and then the army besieging them said, "Oh wow, God's unhappy with them. He's throwing rocks at them." And so that fired them up, and so the village surrendered. But there were other cases here. For example, a general by the name of Charlemagne, which you may have heard of in history, early in one of his battles, meteor fell in front of him and actually caused his horse to buck. And now he could have been injured in this, and he wasn't. But they decided to actually go invade a different village at the time. So it changed the course of a battle. Other cases here that have happened is there have been stories about a ship that was hit by a rock thrown from the sky. Other people talking about rocks falling from the sky and doing this, that, and the other. And most people just saw those nonsense. Okay, I mean, God, after all, rocks don't just fall from the sky unless you live near a volcano, they thought. And then this really came to fruition in 1803. In 1803, in this little French village to the west of Paris, then there was suddenly this flash of light, a meteor in the sky. People said what they heard sounded like thunder, and there are these rocks that fell from the sky. And Jean-Baptiste Biot, director of the French Academy of Sciences at the time, said, he's going to go out there and prove once and for all rocks don't fall from the sky. And so a few weeks later, he comes back to Paris and gives this speech before the Academy saying he has proof absolutely the rocks will actually fall from the sky. Because this village had these rocks, they actually hit some cattle, they were embedded in the roofs of buildings here, and he had samples of these rocks, and the rocks were weird. First of all, they had little flakes of iron in them, elemental iron. That means iron that has not corroded due to oxygen in the atmosphere, meaning these rocks had never been exposed to oxygen in the atmosphere until they hit the village. Secondly, he was able to ascertain these rocks did not match any igneous rock. They could not have come from a volcano. The rocks were definitely not metamorphic, but the rocks also did not act like or look like any known sedimentary rock. And so the only conclusion he could come up with is that these rocks had not been part of Earth until they hit the village. And so they hit the atmosphere, they came through, they hit the village. And so, in fact, they believe it was one big rock came through that fragmented when it slammed to the atmosphere. The shock in the atmosphere, the deceleration fragmented it and showered the village with these little rocks. And so this made them start rethinking the whole idea of rocks falling from the sky. So this idea gives us a new definition in terminology. We have a meteor. A meteor is that flash of light that flashes across the sky. The meteorite is the solid rock that hits the ground, and when it's out in space, you call it a meteoroid. Okay. Now, notice this is very similar sounding to asteroid. What's the difference in meteoroid and asteroid? Well, it really depends. If you have something that's, several miles across, you're pretty comfortable calling it an asteroid. If it's several feet across, was that a tiny asteroid or is it a big meteoroid? Well, it kind of depends. If you discover it, if it's an asteroid, you want to be notified the discovery. You don't get credited discovery of a meteoroid. So so typically, that encourages you, if you'd be the one to discover it, to say it's an asteroid. Likewise, if it's heading at you, you're more likely to call it an asteroid. This village, this French village was not unusual. Turns out that these things hit all the time. In fact, it's believed that a building a year is struck by a meteorite somewhere on Earth. Now, buildings are a pretty large portion of the Earth's surface, so meteorites do strike the buildings now and then. Vehicles have been struck by meteorites. People have been struck by meteorites. Now, your book refers to one person in Alabama having been struck by a meteorite, but there are records of other people being struck. Usually, these are anecdotal records. It's someone in a small village in some remote part of some developing nation says, yeah, the rock came out of the sky and killed this guy and we buried him. Okay, generally when something like that happens, you just think some deity was unhappy with him and threw a rock at him. So that's what people were thinking, and they just buried him. There have been other cases here historically that people have been talking about meteorites that came and hit, people. This one woman in Alabama, she was sitting on a couch. Meteorite hits the roof of her house, comes crashing through the ceiling, strikes her on the hip, and fractures her hip. So your book, when it says she's the only person known to have been struck by a meteorite, that's probably not entirely correct. She's probably about the only person with an insurance claim, okay, that had a meteorite, been investigated, et cetera, et cetera. So she's the most famous person, but there are other people probably in, other parts of the world that have been struck. Okay. The smaller the things are, the more likely, the more of them are flying around the solar system, so the more they hit Earth. We believe that between 300 and 700 tons of stuff actually hits Earth every day. Sometimes more, but between 300 and 700 tons. So hundreds of tons of stuff every day falling from the sky. You know what this means? It means the chicken was right. The sky is falling. And so, and there are bigger things that are out there. And we talked about some of these bigger impacts with asteroids earlier in the semester. But there are things falling from the sky. And so next thing we want to talk about is these meteorites themselves.